the IRS has increased limits on many savings plans. But do we see this? Do you see this happening on a more permanent basis for specifically the dependent care FSA anytime soon?
That's interesting. I'm actually going to move to the next slide. And I promised the audience that is not a planted question, but is actually an excellent transition into the other piece of legislation that came and went. So Tony, I'm going to pause on that question because I am actually going to hit on that right now. So the other piece of legislation that came and went was the American Rescue Plan Act, also known as ARPA. And ARPA had two major provisions. Again, we're talking about provisions that impacted the Health and Welfare Administration world of pre-tax accounts and COBRA. And one pretty impactful piece of this was the fact that a COBRA subsidy was offered. So for folks who had had a involuntary termination over a certain period of time, it was offered to those individuals to essentially get free COBRA, free medical, dental, vision coverage for a period of up to 6 months from April through September of 2021. So that option came into play for that period of time and then was no longer offered. The other piece was that this legislation offered a temporary increase to the dependent care FSA maximum. So for those employers who offer a dependent care FSA, you probably know that the maximum has been $5,000 since the dawn of time, essentially. So since these plans were beginning to be offered, it's always been at $5,000 and has never been increased. So this was the first point in time where we saw the option for an increase. Unfortunately, it was temporary and it was only for the 2021 calendar year, which again, going back to the plan year versus off-calendar plan year discussion, this made it really challenging for off-calendar FSA years to adopt this provision. You had to do a lot of juggling. But even for folks who have a calendar year dependent care FSA, it wasn't necessarily something that was widely adopted because there are other stipulations that came with it. So this was a temporary thing, and it did require an opt-in. It did require action on the part of the employer to make this election, specifically the dependent care FSA we're talking about, to accept this temporary maximum of $10,500. And it did go away after the 2021 calendar year. But to get back to the question about whether it will be increasing anytime soon, there's actually been some movement in Washington to make an increase like this more permanent. There's a bill, and the name of the actual bill is escaping me, but there's a bill that's received some pretty good traction in terms of getting bipartisan buy-in, and it has in it actually a provision to increase the dependent care maximum to $10,500 and allow for indexing, much like the other benefit plans where you'd see an increase potentially every year or every 2 years. So the short answer is that nothing is definitive, but there is some movement to make this a more permanent thing, because as we know, daycare costs are typically well above $5,000 a year. And to give folks the ability to put in a little bit more would be a huge thing. One more thing though, I'll say about the dependent care FSA, for those employers who offer dependent care, you may know, hopefully you know, that there's some pretty stringent non-discrimination testing rules that go along with dependent care FSA. There are actually non-discrimination testing rules that go with health FSA, that even go with your general cafeteria plan. Dependent care FSA, however, has the most commonly failed test of all. It's a test called the 55% average benefits test. And unfortunately, an employer can offer dependent care broadly to their organization, and yet it's a utilization test that looks at who exactly in your organization is using the dependent care dollars and what percentage of those folks are highly compensated versus non. So for that reason, it's a very commonly failed test. So with this potential increase that I just referenced, where the government might allow for folks to put in, let's say, $10,500 in the dependent care, you could see a secondary or a heightened risk with failing non-discrimination testing. You could see that to even a higher extent than today. So along with this lobbying that's happening in DC for a higher maximum, there's also lobbying that's going right along with it to say, let's change the nature of this 55% test, because in my humble opinion, it's a bit of an inherently unfair test in the way that it's designed, because as an employer, you could have all the good intentions in the world to offer this benefit broadly, and it just so happens that a certain population takes advantage of it. and you end up failing this test, and there's a whole series of consequences as a result. So I bring this up to say that there is some movement on this front in Washington. We're part of a lobbying group called ECFC, and they spend some time in Washington fighting for HSAs and FSAs, dependent care. And this is one of the priorities. It's to give dependent care access to a higher level and to give access to more folks than it is today. So a bit of a tangent there, not necessarily all related to ARPA, but just wanted to let everyone know that this is some potential changes that are coming down the line, and really for the better.